Well, the Brazilian Defense Ministry, you should know, oversees Brazilian air traffic control, and it oversees the Brazilian accident investigation. The other compounding factors were that they were in the middle of a presidential election. And we were having a war of words with Chavez in Venezuela. The president of Brazil didn't want to be seen as a puppet of the U.S. And the U.S. didn't want to put pressure on him to have to force him to denounce us in some way. So the revealing thing in all this was also the silence of the U.S. government that continued for the 2 months that our guys were there. The silence of the elected government in Washington and the inaction of our elected officials, with the exception of Peter King, who stepped up and defended our guys and went after the State Department and went after whatever levels of government he could do to help get the freedom of our pilots. He was the only one who spoke out. He was the only one who wasn't concerned with whether this was going to end happily or not in terms of our role in this accident. We spent a lot of time lobbying Senator Schumer's office. We spent a lot of time lobbying Senator Clinton's office, and we really basically got nothing but the brush off. We'll go back to that in a second. We went to the military base. We negotiated the terms of the passport surrender. There's still debate about whether the U.S. consular folks should even have agreed your passport is the property of the U.S. government. And there's a lot of people who don't believe that the government officials should have cooperated in that kind of exchange. But again, you're in hostile territory. As an American in trouble in another country, you're a hassle. I used to think that if I got in trouble in another country, that the U.S. government would help me out, save me, make everything right, get me out. I'm not talking about if I, was driving drunk and hit a school bus. But if I were in the right and I were doing the right thing, I always felt that the U.S. government would be there for me. And I have sad news for you. You're an inconvenience. And they don't determine policy in country. So even if they wanted to help you, their hands are tied unless Washington tells them to help you. They're used to dealing with visas and other things, but to have a U.S. citizen in trouble is not at the top of their list of things they like to do. They were nice, don't get me wrong. They were hospitable. My joke when the pilots finally were leaving the country, I got a call and said, "Don't worry, the consulate said we have our full and complete support on your departure." And I said, "Full and complete support is like coffee and donuts, or?" And it turned out they did provide some security, but for the return home, but they didn't do an awful lot. Passports were taken away. We hunkered down in a hotel. Our lawyer arrived. NTSB arrived. And some other helpers arrived. We had, as I said, intense security, and basically locked ourselves away in a suite at the Marriott on Copacabana Beach. The press was outside. I wouldn't say 24/7 because the Brazilian press is actually a little bit lazy. They have a lot of holidays, and it seemed that whenever there was a holiday, the press went home. Paris Hilton gets more coverage on holidays than these guys got on holidays in Brazil. But they're always a threat. And the press just kept stirring the pot and stirring the pot and stirring the pot. So these guys, even though I left after a week, I know these guys were under siege for 71 days. They were at physical risk. USA Today printed a story in the middle of the first week about how a Swiss air traffic controller was stabbed to death after his criminal conviction by a victim's father in an accident that he caused. The last thing we needed in the world was for USA Today, or any media, to plant these kind of ideas. We already had enough garbage going on from the Brazilian government, from the lawyers who started to circle the families, because 154 deaths in a U.S. trial, if you say it's $2 million a person, which is probably higher in U.S. courts by juries, and if a lawyer in the U.S. takes a quarter of that, they stood to make $80 million or more. So they stirred the pot, and they filled the void, and they filled the silence and the vacuum that we couldn't fill. because we were afraid of saying or doing anything that would make a judge or a policeman or a prosecutor angry enough to throw our guys in jail, to kill our guys. We went through the court process, we went through appeals, and finally on December 5th, accident happened September 29th, on December 5th they spent Thanksgiving in a hotel in Brazil. We finally got, on appeal, a 3-judge panel that ruled that there was no basis in Brazilian law for the retention of the passports and that they should be freed. Oh, but by the way, they gave the federal police another 72 hours to try to make something stick. So instead of just handing them the passport, us having an airplane ready and waiting, they gave them another 72 hours to have at our guys. The last day, December 9th, our guys were finally permitted to get on an airplane and fly home, but not before a police interrogation. And I don't know if you read a Newsday, they would never report this kind of detail with this kind of accuracy. From the Monday and Tuesday after the accident to December 9th, does anybody know how many times our pilots were interrogated or questioned by a Brazilian official? To guess. 0. 0. Until December 9th, on their way out the door. And instead of questioning, what they did was, it's a different set of laws, but basically it's short of an indictment, but it's called an accusation. And they accused them before this is how, they didn't even do it right. I mean, we could have written it better than that. Instead of questioning them and making the accusation, they made the accusation and then tried to question them. And our guys just, with the help of a lawyer, said, it's not going to happen. Save it for when you get to the next stage. And they went to a Legacy, which we had chartered, and they flew home. And the next day, on December 10th, we had a huge ceremony to welcome them home back in our hangar at Iceland. One of the things you learn through this whole process is that if you're in an accident, you're going to be fighting your lawyers, because lawyers want to stay silent and mitigate damages and keep costs low. And they may not be looking out for the best interests of you as an ongoing company. Our insurance company did a phenomenal job for us, but we kept saying, but we're not going away. So we have to defend ourselves. We have to have a face, and we have to have a voice. And some of those faces and voices didn't come from company officials, they came from our lawyers. But we also got groups like NBAA, NATA, Flight Safety Foundation, to try to correct a lot of the misinformation in the press. It's astounding. I was in the press for 25 years. I was in media for 25 years before I got into aviation. I spent time in talk radio. I wrote for Business and Commercial Aviation magazine. I was at ABC and NBC and Bloomberg. And I thought I understood how the press worked, and I never understood why everybody hated the press as much as a lot of people do. Then I got in the middle of a major news story, and I figured it out. They're short on facts, they're short on time. Their deadlines are artificial deadlines for you. Complex stories are things that they really don't want to get involved in or educate themselves too much in, because it was an education process. Every time they wrote a story that was factually incorrect, Lisa Hendrickson, our PR person, Bill Voss from Flight Safety Foundation, and others, and we would try to educate them and say, you have to understand the difference between a flight plan and a clearance. You have to understand the rules of the road and whether, who has the big picture of the sky. We tried to educate them to make them understand the importance of the accuracy of the reporting. And while we weren't putting people out to be interviewed directly, it didn't absolve them of their obligation to be factually correct. And yet repeatedly, one of the headlines in Newsday, one of the lead paragraphs in Newsday that I'll never forget was, everyone agrees that the Legacy was at the wrong altitude, but nobody can understand why. Well, first of all, who's everybody? We had CVR tapes that showed we were at the assigned altitude. So the people who heard those tapes and understood aviation, they weren't part of everybody. And those tapes showed that wrong was wrong. Wrong in terms of air traffic control, putting 2 airplanes on a collision course for an hour. Yeah, that was the wrong altitude. But the wrong action was on the part of Brazilian air traffic control, not in the Legacy cockpit. And yet to this day, you'll read and hear stories that talk about rules of the road. I was on Nightline a couple of months ago when the NTSB report came out, and they dragged out one of the plaintiff's lawyers who starts talking about rules of the road and, just regurgitating all this misinformation. And the press loves a quotable person, so they filled this gap with quotable people. And the quotable people had an agenda. The criminal investigation of this accident was concluded 6 months or so after the accident. The professionals in Brazil took over 2 years. I used to refer to the Brazilian accident investigators as like the American NTSB. But they proved, as the investigation unfolded, that they weren't. I joke that the president of the Accident Investigation Commission, had the worst job in Brazil because he had two choices. He could find the truth, and the truth would show that our actions were correct. Or he could save his job and not attract negativity from all his countrymen and launch a politically motivated investigation and collusion. And sadly, the report that came out from the Brazilian investigators showed that their marching orders came in the days after the accident. And it came from the Brazilian defense minister, who was fired a short time after. But he did lay out the marching orders. And the marching orders were, it was the American pilot's fault, and Brazilian air traffic control really shouldn't be faulted at all. And while they faulted Brazilian air traffic control, if you read the 260 some odd page report, you'll see that when there was some blame to lay at the feet of Brazilian air traffic control, it was buried in a line somewhere. When they talked about our pilots' eyes being brown, it was pages. Because they set out to defame our pilots and to question their abilities and to question their integrity and to paint a picture of perfection in Brazilian air traffic control. For anybody who's ever flown in Brazil, anybody ever flown in Brazil? Were there any black holes in radar or radio coverage there? One or two? The inadequacy of Brazilian radar and radio coverage is well known. But to the end of the investigation, Brazilian officials denied that. Because I guess for national pride reasons and others, they just couldn't be found to have any fault in the deaths of their countrymen. And when an airliner crashed about 6 months later, totally unrelated, totally different causes, the one thing that was the same from our crash to the next one was the script that they followed. And the script was, it has nothing to do with the government of Brazil. It has nothing to do with how we run the airports, the condition of the airports. It was the pilots, it was pilot error, they messed up. And the difference that we had is that our pilots did the inconvenient thing of surviving. So all of us on the airplane could fight back and defend ourselves.